Chaos Divided, your weekly dose of wholesome hammer. If you're a fan of what we do, we hope you'll subscribe and follow us along. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can find us on patreon.com/Chaos Divided 40K. This week, I'm joined by the ever amazing Tanya Gates, the Wall Mistress, for a probably spicy conversation about women in wargaming.
I have many, many thoughts.
Yes. So to get us started, you've picked a quote. It's your first divided quote.
I know. Let's go. There was a new stillness to her face. She seemed to be denying herself all forms of emotion. The great wound was in her eyes. Her features were still those of the young woman she was, but the eyes were inhumanly ancient. They had once held flecks of gold. Now they were nothing but gold. They were filled with terrible knowledge. And that's the inner dialogue of Commissar Yarrick from the novel Imperial Creed.
And here I thought that was the impression of any woman coming out of a Warhammer GT. So.
Just terrible knowledge. I've seen things.
I've seen too much. I know more than I should.
Yeah. Yeah, and I felt that this quote was fitting because my whole thoughts on women in wargaming in general have changed a lot since I first came into this hobby 10 years ago. I feel like I've learned a lot of things, not only just about myself, but about other women in general and why or why not they don't even want to come to the table. So yeah, I'm excited.
I know this was I feel like this is a big topic, and I do kind of want to say I feel like a lot of this is going to be rooted in both of our experiences, which I think are different.
Very different. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of moving parts to this conversation, and I think the big thing though I think is that we have the conversation, because I feel like it often isn't a conversation. It's either like somebody throwing their point of view out there with very little back and forth, or what I imagine happens a lot of the time is just people not saying anything or not really wanting to deal with it. So I think you have kind of both ends of the spectrum of a lot of things not being said, and then a lot of things being said but without any context or dialogue.
Yeah. And I think also a problem with this topic in general is that some people think that a woman is going to speak for every single person, like every other single woman, and that's just not the case, right? Every woman is going to have their own experiences. I can only speak from mine. I don't speak for everybody. I don't want to. I don't want that expectation put on me. So when we're having these conversations, I just want everybody to know that there's no possible way that I can know every single woman's experience, but this is my experience and my thoughts. And if people want to push back on those, I encourage it. I do think that it's an important conversation that we have.
Absolutely. And I think, you have been in this space for a long time in a lot of different ways. And I think, that doesn't mean you have a totality of experience and you don't speak for everyone, but I think you do have a lot of experience to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I think so, but I also feel like whether you're just coming in or whether you've been in here for 20 years, everybody's experience is interesting. I always find it super interesting to hear other women's experiences. And I think everybody should, if they feel comfortable, sort of share their thoughts and experiences, because I do feel like a lot of women in general feel a lot of imposter syndrome, and maybe that's going to keep them from sharing. And I just want to encourage anybody, if you have thoughts or if you have ideas on how the community could, be better, or even if the community is really good for you, sometimes sharing that is also really great. So
I think it's
Yeah.
just as important to share those stories, because I think
Yeah.
often we only hear the negative, and that doesn't really give you a path forward. So the positive stories are just as important for others to use as an example. You know, not
Yeah. And I
everywhere's.
think, sorry.
I was just going to say, not everywhere is perfect, but knowing what better looks like is much more important than getting it perfectly right all the time.
And I know that there's several women who are, I don't want to say scared, but hesitant to even go into a game store in real life because all that they've heard is negative
Mm.
stereotypes. And honestly, like, even lately, a lot of those negative stereotypes are being perpetrated on very large social media accounts in an attempt to be funny. I can think of two right now that are kind of main offenders for this. And I just don't think that having those narratives be so forefront in our minds, I don't think that that's doing any favors for getting women and non-binary folks into game stores. So I think that this is an important conversation for us to have in an attempt to sort of switch that narrative and say,
Mm.
like depending on where you are, it's going to be a lot different from other experiences, right? Because my experience is so different from yours, and I do think that it's a bit of a regional kind of difference, personally.
And I do think, we can talk about this kind of throughout, but I do think like wargaming is in a different category than a lot of other kind of like nerdy hobbies, like D&D and tabletop RPGs have seen a lot more women, coming in and being a part and being like active participants in game stores that I've seen in the last 10 years. And even like Magic, which is like historically been like very like man-centered, is like seeing more women playing, and I feel like wargaming is like starting down that road, but we're like, it's definitely behind. So there's something that I think we need to talk about there, and I don't know exactly what it is, and hopefully as we talk it'll kind of come out, but I think there's something, either it's Warhammer or wargaming in general, that just like isn't as conducive. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the magic beans aren't.
I have some thoughts for sure.
Okay.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess to get started, kind of, this is your topic. So where do you want to get started? What are your thoughts?
I think that we should talk about D&D specifically, because when you try to have these conversations with some people, because, okay, I am of the opinion that I don't think wargaming is ever going to have 50% female participation. I just don't think that we're ever going to get there. And whenever I say that to people, I get a lot of pushback. I get some really angry pushback from mostly men, actually, who have this idea that, in order to be inclusive and welcoming or whatever, that wargaming has to have 50% female participation. And one of the main things that they come back with is D&D. Well, D&D has probably almost 50% female participation at this point. If it's not 50%, it's got to be pretty dang close. And my response to that is that the only real things that they have in common are that they're played on a table, they both have books, and you roll dice for both of them. In my opinion, those are the only things that they really have in common.
See, I would actually argue the opposite. D&D comes right out of wargaming. Like first edition, second edition, and even in third edition D&D were heavily rooted in wargaming. And it wasn't really until the last two editions, which again, maybe I'm arguing the opposite point here, but it's really fourth and fifth that have finally kind of gotten away from those wargaming roots.
And that's when women came in.
Yeah, so maybe, yeah. That's what I realized halfway through, that I'm arguing your point. with, I guess I'm just bringing more facts in. But no, Gary Gygax was a huge wargaming nerd, and D&D was built around wargaming concepts.
I could see that. I can see that specifically for D&D. I can't really see it for a lot of other role-playing game systems. I'm just going to preface this by saying, while I have played a lot of D&D, it's not my favorite. It's actually really low on the list of role-playing games that I enjoy. So why do we think in these later editions now more women are coming in?
I don't know, because even I think of my own D&D groups now, and they're mostly women, and I don't really know, like, I am not a different DM than I was 15 years ago. But I will say, yeah, I think D&D has become less crunchy. I was going to say earlier, Kaylee and I kind of went through some popular games at one point, and we described D&D as ketchup. Like, it is the accessible, easily accessed, easy to pick up game. Like, when you think of nerdy hobbies, like you don't even need to buy anything. Like, if your friend has like a PDF of a D&D book, like, you're good. Like, I guess you need dice. So like, what, you got a $10 like barrier. So like, it's very low cost to enter. And yeah, I do think this might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but I actually kind of liked 4th edition because they streamlined so much of it. It ended up actually being more focused on role-playing, and I think 5th edition actually cleaned that up even more. That, like, I sometimes find myself like remembering 3rd edition rules or something that I like had used in 3rd edition from 2nd edition and overcomplicating something, and then you go look it up and you're like, oh wow, this is actually I made this so much worse. Like, I am the problem here. So yeah, I think it's really like, I wouldn't even say the crunch has been removed, because I think there's still a lot of like crunchy goodness if you want to get into it. But it's definitely not as like front-centered with D&D anymore.
So I think that, it's a couple of things, right? In the older editions, maybe women weren't exposed to it is probably the first thing, right? Women were just like not really sold on the idea of it.
I mean, it was marketed to teenage boys, like, exclusively.
Yeah. And so Wizards of the Coast, I think rightly so, saw that there was, a big untapped market. And I think that Critical Role really showed women that you can play a cooperative game, which I think women in general are more into, right? A lot of women don't like conflict, right? Or they really enjoy conflict resolution because they tend to be really good at it, right? And then on top of that, it has this really sort of creative, sort of like make-believe kind of aspect to it, in which you can play out social situations in a sort of way that doesn't have any real consequences.
Yeah.
And so I think by showing that it's more that and less miniatures on a table, I think that is what makes it appealing to women in general, more so than wargaming does, right? Because wargaming is, in fact, just a giant conflict.
Yeah, and I even think of like I know a lot of women who are into like Settlers of Catan, which is one of the most like brutal, for anyone who's played it. It's like it's a brutally strategic game, but it doesn't actually have a combat mechanic. Like, it's technically like competitive cooperative. And yeah, I would say there's a lot. So I don't even know if it was necessarily like, there's definitely something about the like lack of conflict centrality maybe that makes it more accessible just for for more women to come into it.
I know that early on in my career in Warhammer, I heard things like, "Oh, women just don't think tactically." So, well, actually, they said strategically, but that's incorrect. What they really meant was tactically. Losers. Um, but we know that that isn't actually the case because women have been
Mhm.
playing tactics style games forever. Women play cards.
Yeah.
Cards is a tactics game. It's a logic game. Women love things like that. So we can't say that it's the tactics itself. Women also play sports. Like
Hmm.
they play team sports and they love it. And you know, um again, maybe team sports is like more of a cooperative kind of thing and women really love that, but there's a huge tactics element to it. Every play is tactics.
Hmm.
So we can't say that that is what's holding them back either, right? So there's got to be other things that are leading to women not wanting to do this. So one of the things that I think is, and again, you touched on this and you're talking about D&D, is the time and money commitment that it takes to play Warhammer. You just don't have that same commitment when it comes to board games, D&D, cards, like literally any other game, even a sport. In a lot of cases, you just need like a ball and shoes, and then just the desire to do it, right? Whereas with wargaming in general, you have this giant rule book, and then you have your codex or your battle tome or whatever game that you started with. You're gonna have that, and then on top of that, you're gonna have all of the changes on top that come down every quarter, and then on top of that, you have to paint your miniatures before you even get to the table. And for a lot of women, that's just, especially women our age, it's not something that they can or want to prioritize.
I want to throw out a concept here because it's kind of coming to me as you're talking about this. We sometimes talk about like barriers to entry,
Mhm.
but I want to kind of reframe this more as Warhammer has a very high hurdle to disappointment. You have to do a
Yes.
whole hell of a lot
Yes.
before you even find out if you actually like any of this.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's a huge uncertain disappointment factor that you have to commit a ton to. Because, like, if we're talking about cost, I know women who play absolute gobs of board games, and their board game collection monetarily puts my Warhammer collection to shame. And I don't have a small collection of Warhammer.
Mhm.
Like, I don't think it's purely cost. I think
No.
it's the hurdle to disappointment of like, hey, and I think we're going to talk about a lot of these things, but like, it's like, hey, do I want to spend a lot of money, put a lot of time and effort that I don't have a ton of into something that involves me hanging out with people that maybe I think will make me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just don't think that time sink means as much to men, and I don't care if that makes people mad, because I have enough girlfriends who are married to understand cleaning the house, taking care of the kids, making sure that you're, clean, moisturized, socialized, eating healthy, you're trying to exercise, like all of those things for women in generally are going to take precedence over reading a stupid rule book and painting stupid miniatures, right? And I think in a lot of cases, men will let some of that go in order to do this thing that they have an interest in.
I mean, the stereotype of the like unbathed nerd playing Warhammer is not 100% untrue. We
all know
played
at
against
least one.
Yeah, who chose painting minis over showering that day.
Yes.
Yeah. So no, I think there's 100%, and I mean, even when you talk to a lot of men, even if they're married and they have kids, there's very rarely, I don't know very many men that I'm like, oh, you do everything but I know a lot of women that I go, oh, you do everything. Like,
Yeah.
he just like keep things functioning.
Yeah. I mean, I even think about like the difference between how I clean the house and how my husband cleans the house. And I am so grateful that he does help me, right? I have a structural problem with my body that makes it very difficult for me to mop floors. So he does that for me. I'm super grateful. He is the best. But when I clean the kitchen, I see all the drips and the stains and the smears and stuff that are on the front facings of my cabinets, and I wipe those down. His brain doesn't see it, right? So it's like, and like you can't really like force somebody to see it. Like if their brain just isn't looking for it, they're just not going to see it, right? So in that regard, like women are just going to do more around the house in general, I think. I mean, not all women, because I know some women that are like slobs, right? But in general, I think when you think about all of the things that you have to do, women just see more things that they have to prioritize for themselves than what men do. Is they're just going to have less time in the day to be able to do hobby. And that's, I don't think anybody's going to change my opinion on that, but I mean, feel free. Feel free to try.
You know, we can make this, you know, a little bit more, and there have been plenty of studies done that on average women have much less recreation time than men. Like married women, single women, like just they have less recreation time. That is just like, that has been studied. That is, you know, we don't have to put in like personal conjecture here. Like that is a societal fact. And, you know, I think that that's maybe an issue we should work on in general. But, you know, we're not going to solve that by talking through a conversation talking about Warhammer.
That's right.
So no, that is a known issue. Like, you know, you might that needle is moving, but it has not moved.
But even if you think about it like this, okay? My husband showers, it takes him 10 minutes. He has a bar of soap and shampoo. That's it. I shower. I'm in the shower proper for 20 to 30 minutes. And then I have to like moisturize my entire body and do my hair and brush my teeth. If I'm going out, I might put on makeup and I do all this stuff. That's like an extra, 40 minutes that he's downstairs doing models that just takes me to get ready for the day. Right. And if you if you think about it and like, okay, he cleans the kitchen and it takes him 10 minutes. I clean the kitchen and it takes me 20 minutes. Well, that's another 10 minutes that comes out of my hobby time. Yeah. Right. And it's just like all these little things, because we have more attention to detail and the details matter. That's coming out of the hobby time. Right.
For sure. No. And I think, you know, yeah, however you end up getting there, that is, like I said, that's just like a known fact. Mm-hmm. There just like is less time. Your clock has fewer hours.
It does. It really does. But I mean, the problem starts before that. I think that's a problem once somebody has decided that maybe this is something that does interest them. The biggest problem is that it just does not interest most women.
Yeah, and I don't
even want to say it's a problem, actually. It's not a problem because people are allowed to have their own interests. Whatever makes them happy, they need to pursue that. And I just think for most women, it's not something that's ever going to interest them.
I mean, I do think there is, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say that there's a goal of like 50% women and 50% men at every tournament ever. Like that's a weird metric for like inclusivity at any point in time.
I know.
But also like I don't think that's that's not a super helpful way of like measuring progress.
I agree.
But does that also mean that like Wargaming couldn't be like marketed differently to be more like open and receptive? Because I do think like Wizards of the Coast has very specifically tried to broaden the horizon of their games in a way that Games Workshop and most like wargaming company. Like it's not even just, I'm not even gonna throw like Games Workshop uniquely under the bus for this, but like a lot of it is just like super masculine, like coded messaging. It's a lot of just like raw blood, violence, death, skulls, rah, which like again, there's a lot of like women who are super into like heavy metal music, but that's their jam.
That's me.
But then like wargaming is just like that kind of seems weird and gross though. Like it's just like there's something there that like could be different, I think, that would make it a warmer reception. But it's like if you picture it as a field, it is a field full of like mines, barbed wire, and then a giant hill to climb at the top, at the end of it. And it's just like, why bother? Why put your limited time and energy into figuring out if you even like that when there are so many other things that are more easily accessed?
Yeah. But even if you think about it, okay, so what if it is the content in and of itself, right? So let's take a look at Game of Thrones. I know so many women that love Game of Thrones, but yet none of them have played A Song of Ice and Fire. So is it a problem with the content itself?
I don't necessarily mean it's the content. Like if we talk about like the lore, it's even just like the packaging and the way everything is presented. Like nothing is even easy to figure out. Like I know how to manage Warhammer because I've been doing it for so long. I know how to do it. But if you like, if you're just like, hey, there's these little mini things and I like painting them and I'm gonna like figure out how to play the game, you're like, oh well, you gotta buy this book and that book. But like nobody tells you that. It's not obvious that you need all those things. Nobody, like, it's not even obvious that you like need a tape measure. Like it's like there's a lot of steps that it's like, okay, like even if you're like, hey, I'm a big like D&D fan, and you're like, oh well, do you have like 40 D6s? Because like, you know, if you don't, this is gonna be super annoying for you. And they're just like, well, I have like 8, and you're like, well, okay, you're gonna be doing a lot of batch rolling, and they're like, okay. So it's just like you're not necessarily set up for success here. You know, we talk about like D&D of being like, hey, go spend $8 on some dice and you're good to go, and you need a pencil and a like piece of paper, versus like uncovering this like arcane, unexplained, like even going through like Games Workshop's website, there is no like if there's no button that's just like, hey, I'm a new player, and it's like, hey, here's the stuff you need if you want to do this.
But I also feel like that might scare people away as well.
Even if it just started with Combat Patrol of like, hey, here's a thing to get started that isn't like, it's the cost of a very expensive board game.
It should have dice in it.
Yes, it should.
Like the Combat Patrol should have everything that you need. It should have dice. It should have a whippy stick.
Yes, you know? Why don't we have whippy sticks anymore?
That's how long we've been in it. We remember whippy sticks.
I remember those whippy.
Oh, I got really excited when my husband brought home Old World because it had whippy sticks in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but that's what I mean. Like, you know, yeah, there's the big box sets, but those are like friggin' $300.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a super accessible way. Like, I know there is the edition box that is technically your starter that gets you a lot of the way there. But then you also have to know to buy that, and nobody tells you that.
Yeah.
Like, the Leviathan box is just like a big face on the front, and just like, that's what that is, I guess. And you have to, like, somebody has to tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's definitely super overwhelming. But so the reason why I think that the interest just isn't there is because I used to play roller derby. I started off on a women's only team, and then by the time when I hurt myself, I was playing co-ed. But while I played on the women's only team, I was like, hey, I literally asked every single person on my team. I was like, hey, I play this really cool game. It's like tactical, like what we do on the track. And I have everything that you need to get started. And I'd really like to play with you. And like, I tried so many tactics. I tried starting with like, oh, that person really likes sci-fi. I'm gonna try that angle. No? Okay, well, that person's really creative and like works in an art industry. I'm gonna try the art aspect. No interest. Like, oh, this person is like our tactical genius. I'm gonna like try to sell the game on that angle. No interest. So like, do you know how many people I got to actually try the game through almost 6 years of playing roller derby?
None.
None. None.
Yeah.
Not one woman was interested, no matter how I approached it. Nobody wanted to play this game. Zero interest.
You know what I think is maybe, I guess the conversation about accessibility, I think, is because I have thought about this before. And one of the things that I've noticed about Warhammer is it's one of the few things, period, that I've ever noticed there are more trans women involved than cis women. And a lot of those trans women, I think, get involved before they're out as teenagers. So it's more accessible to them when they're younger. And in a way that, again, coming back to that whole, like, it's not made very accessible for a lot of women. Like, if this is something you'd even played as, like, a teenager, then you'd be coming back to it later on in life if you wanted to. And it would always be there, and you'd have some base knowledge of it. And I think that's why you see that disparity of, like, trans women before coming out face fewer barriers to getting into it, because, like, they're like nerdy buds are like also getting into this. Like, that's how I got into Warhammer, is like all of my friends who were super big nerds were like, hey, we're gonna get into this thing, and I was like, I'll also play this thing, I guess. And then like I ended up liking it and came back to it later on in life. But if you never have that early on experience,
Yeah.
then you have no basis for it.
Right. And so my friend group in high school was basically all nerdy dudes, right?
Yeah.
I was not even shown Warhammer, not once. I never saw their collections when I went over to their house to like make music or anything like that. Never saw anything. All we would ever do is like go skateboarding or play Tony Hawk or like record stupid covers of songs and stuff. And like I never was exposed to Warhammer. And then once I found Warhammer and I started, posting pictures of the things I'm painting and stuff, like my best friend out of that group was like, oh, you like Warhammer? We were playing all the time in high school and we thought that you wouldn't be interested.
And you know what? I guess that I was gonna bring this up because having lived on that other side of the bridge, it was talked about a lot that like women are. It would be like so uncool to tell a woman about Warhammer. Like, I remember being in the Games Workshop store in Halifax, and like a woman would walk in and they would like politely like talk them out of being in the store, and they'd just be like, "What do you think this is a board game store? No, we don't sell board games." Like, they would like actively like remove them from the space. So like everything around you is saying like this is not for women. So then like as like an awkward teenage boy, most of them probably learn of like, you don't talk to women about this. Like that's the least cool thing you can do. This is like this super secret nerdy thing you do. And I remember talking about that. It was like they'd be like, oh, we like can't tell anyone we do this. Like there's used to be a shame component to Warhammer that I feel like we also are just now starting to confront.
I would probably have to agree with that. Like, I didn't get to experience it as a child, obviously. So, and I'm sure that there are some women out there who like don't get it and are totally awful to their partner for wanting to play War Dollies. And that sucks. Don't be that person. Like, I always know where my husband is. He's either at the game store, or he's building models, or he's painting models, or he's playing at our house. He doesn't have time to do anything else,
Yeah. But no, I do think that is a component of like I do think there was an active belief that like women would just so intuitively hate Warhammer that like it would like shame you to tell them about it, or to like admit it, like even in a way that like D&D wasn't on that level. Like, I played like D&D with like other women as a kid, and like that was fine,
Yeah.
But like Warhammer was like that was secret. That was like that was bro code. Like you don't talk about that.
That is so funny. And I mean, I will say most women don't have an interest in it. When you try to explain it to them, they're like, "Oh, that's nice," but it's like no shame. It's not like, "Oh, what are you doing? What are you doing playing that? That's so stupid." Like nobody ever said that. They were just like, "Oh, I love that for you." Right?
Yeah. But I think that's where kind of that like deep shame comes from for a lot of men of like not knowing how to interact and like introduce it to women. And like, you know, and then they get older, they get married, and then their wives are just like, "Oh, that's like the thing that you do and I have absolutely no interest in it." And they just kind of like almost reinforces that women don't care. And then it becomes easier to believe, "Oh, women just inherently don't like Warhammer
Mhm.
or war games." And I think that's where we need to like break the mold a bit is like a lot of women were never given a chance to, and then like yeah, later on in life when you're busy and you got a bunch of other things, you want to like learn this really complicated thing that's expensive and difficult, and like all of the other issues you're like no thank you. But like
Yeah.
when you're like that's a very different entry point than like a lot of guys who are like I don't know 15 years old and have literally nothing but time and like badly painting their first miniatures is just like the one artistic release they feel like they can have and it feels really meaningful to them.
Mm.
So we're not really giving a lot of women the same chance to experience war games in the same way. So I do think there is a lot of like structural challenges in here beyond just like I don't think it's a like women don't like war games because women and war games don't like go together.
Right. I don't think that that's the case.
No.
I do feel like most women are going to have zero interest in it. I think that what is truly important is to meaningfully engage the women who do have an interest in it.
Yeah.
And also not shame the women who only have enough time to do certain aspects of the hobby, right?
Yes.
Like I put hours and hours into studying the dang rules because they change all the time, and my brain is just does not remember rules. It just doesn't. So I have to put in more time than most other people to learn the rules, and I'm blessed that I have a job that basically allows me to do this hobby. If I worked outside of this house, I don't know if I would have enough time to do all of the things to play Warhammer. 'Cause
Mm.
it's not a game for casual people. You can't just play it casually.
No. No.
Yeah.
I no.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no real way to like sugarcoat that. It's a hobby. Like the reason we call it a hobby is like a hobby implies commitment, which like you know many people have many different hobbies.
I mean, I do think that it's getting better, in terms of the marketing side of things. I do think it's getting better. I do think more women have actually heard about Warhammer, and I don't know if that's just because of, like, all the video game titles coming out and the mobile
Mm,
games and, like, it's just sort of becoming more I mean, the Henry Cavill thing definitely didn't hurt also, right? Because some women are like, "Oh, that's the game that Henry Cavill likes, right?" And it's like, "Yes." So, that is great. They're beginning to be exposed to it, which is going to
mm.
give them the opportunity to even evaluate whether it is something that they want to look further into.
I want to ask you. Like, I've now remembered my question. Um, do you know any women who actually played Warhammer as teenagers, or did they get into
I
it
have
later in life?
I have heard of about 2 women who played it as teenagers out of the many years that I have been in this, but almost all of them have been exposed to it via a partner or an older brother or
Mm.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I do think that I guess going back to the marketing and the presentation and the accessibility of just wargaming in general. Um, like I even think of some of the game stores around here, and it's like a different section almost. It's like there's like the D&D section, and there's like the magic, and like, you know, if there's video games or whatever, and then like the wargaming is like off to the side, and there's like it gets like a little darker as you get closer, and like, you know, the sun sets and like the purple light comes on. You know what I mean? Like it's almost treated like it's like, oh, we're in a different
Yeah.
dimension right now. Even though it's just technically one room, it's just like it's off to the side and treated very differently. Of like, this
Yeah.
is a separate thing. Like you're not gonna. It's almost like you're not there's it's presented as if there's no overlap between like people who would be into one, like, you know, somebody coming in for a new D&D source book. It's like, oh well, you're going to a completely different side of the story. You're not even walking by any of the minis. You're not even like looking at what's going on.
Yeah. I will say that my old game store, the when we only had one in town, that was their approach, right? It was actually like a tunnel, like a display tunnel of
Yeah.
like Warhammer that you had to like walk in, and you're like, oh, is this right? You know, am I supposed to be in here?
Yeah.
But my new game store is very sort of aware of, you know, the issues with wargaming in general. So now it's out in the open. Magic the Gathering players even have to play like surrounded by Warhammer stuff, which makes me super happy. Um, so they're very aware of it, and I think that they've solved that problem. But I have a question for you, and I'm gonna set it up first.
Okay.
So I haven't gotten this recently, but when I first started sort of posting on the internet about my hobby journey and stuff, I used to get a particular kind of criticism that said she only plays because her partner probably introduced her to it, as if it was criticism, okay?
Mm.
And to that, I would say, haven't most people found it through somebody that they love and appreciate, whether that be an older brother, a trusted friend, your uncle, your grandfather? Like, wasn't it somebody who cared for you that more than likely introduced you to Warhammer?
Yeah, I mean, having men admit that they love each other is kind of like a whole like societal problem we face.
But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't personally had to deal with that. I think, I mean, I have a wife, so nobody's really like assuming that she's the one who dragged me into Warhammer. So there is like I guess a difference there.
But how did you find Warhammer?
Like I said, it was like my like group of friends as teenagers got into it.
So, was it you who originally found it, or was it one of your friends that originally found the
It was
idea
one of my
of
friends who,
Warhammer?
like,
There you go.
yeah.
There you go. So, like, why are women so special that they need to come to it without having somebody introduce them to it?
No, yeah, no, it's a double standard, 100%.
Right? Like,
And even if you were like some kind of like Warhammer messiah that was like called to the hobby by some like heavenly vision, and you were like, I have never heard of this, but I come to play the Warhams, like, that's cool if that's your story, but like, that doesn't also make you special.
right? Right? I literally don't know anybody who was like, from back in the day, oh, I was looking in a mail order catalog and this Warhammer ad was in it or whatever. Like, you know, no, everybody was introduced by somebody else. I'm
Well,
not
it's
going to say
literally a game
everybody.
that requires
because
two people.
Right. And like, I'm not going to say everybody. There's probably like 10 people on the entire planet who like found it on their own. Maybe they had the opportunity to, you know, live in a place that had a Warhammer store and they walked by, or their mom dropped them off to like, so she could shop or whatever. But like in general, around here, that doesn't exist.
I mean,
right?
If you got dropped off at a Warhammer store by your mom, technically your mom introduced you to Warhammer, so then a woman actually was your gateway into Warhammer. So yeah, yeah. No, I don't know, like, yeah, it's a weird argument to make. Like
Yeah.
because like, yeah, it's like sure, even like whether it's true or not, you're like, cool. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
sure, that
Yeah.
like whatever.
Yeah, my now husband, who was my friend at the time, was the first one to introduce me to Warhammer. Like, good job. Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome.
And now you
Why
guys
does
get to
that
share
why
this thing.
yeah, like why does that like somehow diminish my existence or my validity within the hobby? I'm still spending stupid amounts of hours painting these miniatures and reading the rules and playing the game, but somehow it's not valid because of who showed me it in the first place.
I mean, that gets into the big, I guess, thing we haven't talked about is that, like that's misogyny is what that is. It's
Mhm.
just like a double standard for women that doesn't exist for men.
Even just being told like, oh, you'll never be able to play this game because women's brains aren't tactical. That is straight up misogyny.
Yeah.
Straight up.
And I do
Yeah.
think we do need to talk about that as a community because it does exist. And is every person who plays Warhammer a misogynist? No.
No.
But are there misogynists that play Warhammer? Yes.
Yes. Are they given a carte blanche to do that shit? Yes. In some places, yes. They have been doing it for so long, and it has not been checked by anybody that now the whole community has a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And going back to that, barrier of disappointment, it doesn't take too many of the stories of someone behaving that way for you to just be like, that's one more reason not to.
Yeah.
That
I agree.
any man wanting to play Warhammer doesn't even have to think about.
Yeah. And I will say that in my experience, in my local area, I have not experienced anything like this. On the internet, yes. In real life, no. So I do think that it is very regional, and I think in places like where I live, where we have a very strong, decent human being, actually we have more than one, who sort of police the behavior of the local players and set a standard for behavior. I feel very blessed, essentially, to like live in a place that has that. If you don't have people who are invested in creating a space that is at the bare minimum, like don't say iffy things, like that's the bare minimum. Like, of course this kind of behavior is going to run rampant. I think it's really unfortunate that there are so many really vocal stories of it happening, or people telling stories about bad online interactions, that women think that this is the standard of behavior in every single local game store, and that is keeping a lot of women out.
Absolutely. And I think, maybe to talk to, game store owners, doing more to explicitly talk about how you're combating that, I think would also help. Because a lot of game stores don't address it. Like one of the local ones did, which is one that I've like had issues at and with, did like a Pride night because Wizards of the Coast did like a Pride Magic Commander thing, and I was like, this is so rainbow washed and like disingenuous of you to be doing that. And so that also gets judged. Like if you're not explicitly like doing the work to make your space more welcoming, then you're going to get brushed with that paint of hostility.
Yeah. And I do think that like if you are going to be doing things like Ladies' Night or Pride Night or something like that, people can always tell when it's genuine and when it's not, right? So, if you're doing a Pride Night and you don't have any LGBTQ people there, that's a little bit telling, I think. Also, if you treat those people really poorly in your local area, like, then you shouldn't really be trying to amplify LGBTQ anyway. Although with the Wizards thing, I just don't know if they could get out of that if they're like an official WotC
I don't.
dealer.
I just like. I remember it being like. I remember thinking at the time of like, wow, this is. It was somewhat cringy to me, and like, just knowing.
Why was it cringy?
Just knowing, like, you know, I've been in that store and like been like, you know, misgendered and like talked down to by like the staff or like ignored, and just like I know it's not that welcoming of a store to begin with. So to then be like,
Yeah.
hey, we're having Pride Night that's conveniently the end of June. That's like a Wizards, like it was all Wizards marketing, so it wasn't any of theirs. Like it wasn't something they
Yeah.
had decided to do. So it's just kind of like, okay, you're doing this because you think because Wizards is doing it, and you're not doing any of the other work behind the scenes that can like allow this to be any kind of meaningful at all. And I guess to go back to like, you know, if you want to do a ladies' night or a pride night, like have folks from those communities like involved with organizing it, and also pay them, and like have them be supported in doing that work, and that's how you can meaningfully change the space you have.
And also, I do want to put this out there. I know that it's not an option for most people, especially if you don't feel supported in your local community. But if you do feel like you can, as you know, I can only speak from being a woman because that's the only experience that I have. But if you are a woman and you feel like you could possibly take more of a, I'm going to say, matriarchal role in your local community, I do encourage you to do that. So for myself, I am very invested in my local community because I do want it to continue to be a place where all sorts of different people can feel comfortable and welcome playing. So I do run events. I do try to show up to a number of events locally every year. I am part of a Warhammer team, uh I probably could be running more paint demos at the store. But there's like certain things, like if you feel like you can inject yourself visibly into the community, it is going to make more people feel safer to take the first steps. You know what I mean? If I see a woman in the store looking at Warhammer, I get really excited. And so I just go over to introduce myself and be like, hey, like, I'm Tanya. I really like Warhammer too. I don't try to be too pushy, right? Like, oh, if you ever just want to talk about Warhammer one time, like, I'm totally into it, right? Then I just generally like gauge. And if they just want to look, then I just leave. And if they want to talk, then we talk. And I just try my best to sort of make myself visible.
I mean, there is something like you don't know, when it's Warhammer night or whatever at your local game store, you don't know who's specifically coming in just to see. Like,
Yeah.
They might just be browsing around the shelves, but they might be like, oh, are there any other women here? Is there any, like, anyone who looks like me here? Or am I going to have to, if I want to be involved in this, am I going to have to be the first one? Because, you might have somebody who, like, moves to your, local area who's, like, a giant Warhammer fan, but just, like, doesn't want to be that trailblazer. They've done it before, and, they move there for work or whatever the thousand reasons people move to a new place. And they're like, yeah, I'd love to play Warhammer again. And then they go to, like, a pickup night and they're just like, oh, no, I'm not doing that again. Like, and then they, put the models in the basement and they don't think about them for 5 more years. And I'm sure that happens a lot.
Yeah,
I relatively to how many women are in the like hobby and like, I'm not saying it's a daily occurrence, but like I'm sure that has happened, and maybe not necessarily somebody who's already deeply into it, but they like, bought a combat patrol or a spearhead or Vanguard, whatever the AOS one is, and they painted it up and they're like going in to see like, oh, do I want to play? And then it's just like a bunch of dudes yelling at each other, and they're just like, no thanks, like I don't want to insert myself into this space because I don't know what it's going to be like. And if you've heard enough negative stuff online, your first assumption is not going to be, oh, this is gonna go well. It's, oh, this is gonna go badly.
Yeah, and I do think sometimes when you have those sort of biases, because that is a bias, right? You've never been into this place, but your bias is informed by the things that you've seen before, or maybe even your past experiences in a different location. That bias is going to follow you in. And sometimes I think you see what that bias tells you that you're going to see, if that makes sense. So like, if you think, oh, as soon as I walk in, every dude is going to stare at me, because that is a trope. It's a meme that is pretty pervasive across social media when it comes to gaming stores. Like, you might be looking for that, right? So there might be 10 people playing at the store and one person looks at you and you might think everybody's looking at me, right? And yeah, I do think that I mean, psychology studies have proven that this is a thing, that you do see and perceive things the way that your bias is telling you that they are. And you know, sometimes it's really difficult. It's really, really difficult. And I say this as somebody who had, and still does to some extent, have a bit of bias going into events, specifically with people that I don't know. It's very difficult to put that aside, but when you can put it aside, you are more likely to have a good time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've talked about this, that I've had probably more issues in person than you maybe have had.
I think I've probably had more issues online.
Yes,
you probably had.
I hide in the corners of the internet. Nobody follows me. It's good.
I wish that I did, but this is the path that I have apparently chosen, and so I am committed to it. I hate being recognized at events. I hate it. I just wish that I could be a fly on the wall and that, you know, nobody would know who I am and I can just suck at the bottom tables and like have no expectations. But unfortunately for me, that's not the case for me anymore. And I just need to maybe go to therapy to learn how to get over it. Yeah.
I mean, I've not had it to the same extent, but you could, when you're playing a game and you realize the other person kind of like already knows who you are, and you're like, oh, it does change the game, and it makes it feel a little bit weird.
Yeah, it makes it unenjoyable for me, for sure. Maybe I just need to wear a mask with a voice modulator.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have a very distinctive voice.
I know. Like,
you've done a few too many podcasts.
I have. Yeah, my voice alone has actually made people come to the table to introduce themselves to me, which is great. Like, obviously, like, don't not introduce yourself. Don't not come and say hi. But just, like, please just treat me like a normie.
That's fair.
I'm a normie.
I mean, there's no such thing as Warhammer famous. So,
exactly.
Henry Cavill.
Exactly.
Henry Cavill is Warhammer famous.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes. All of your favorite podcasters and things are just like the most regular, like mid people. They're mid, just like you. So just treat them like mid. That's all.
Yeah. So, no. The more people I get to meet in the whole Warhammer land, it's just everyone's just like a big nerd who just likes Warhammer. Like, no one is like this like larger than life personality. No, and I mean, like, really, we could say Play on Tabletop is one of the stories. Actually, it's probably one of the bigger channels out there, right? Mm-hmm. Right, and all of them just would rather just talk Warhammer with you than have you gush all over them, right? And when I went to the narrative thing with Play On, like so many people were like, "Oh my gosh, that's Nick," or "Oh my gosh, that's JT." Like, oh, it's just like they're like a celebrity, and like the entire time, whenever I'd hear somebody say, "I'd be like, him? He's not a celebrity." No, and even I think it was Movin was like, "This is why we bring Tanya along. She just crushes that ego into dust."
Yeah. But yeah,
That's
they
awesome.
are they're just normal people. Just treat them like normal people. Just say like, "Oh, I really like the podcast." And then tell us about what you're doing. Tell me
Yeah.
about your project. Tell me about your homebrew lore. That makes me way more comfortable than like anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? I think that's honestly that's good advice for like welcoming anyone into the hobby, or is just treat them like people. Just treat them
Yeah.
like just regular people.
Are you also here? Are you an awkward person? Do you have trouble with icebreakers? And there's a new woman in the hobby group that you want to make feel comfortable, but you don't want to make them feel like you're a creepy dude. Then go say, "Hey, I'm so and so. Welcome to the group. Look at this cool thing I painted." There you go.
Uh,
Done.
I've often said the one thing that unites all of us is that we are all way too into Warhammer.
That's right.
So just like let that be the direction you go in. If you're if you're just like, hey, I love Warhammer, they're also
Yeah.
going to be like, hey, I too love Warhammer,
Yeah.
and you just get to talk about that, and that is the best time. So
Yeah. So just like lead with some more. Don't stare at the person thinking about what you're going to say. Just bring a model over and be like, "Look at this cool thing." And then they might be
right,
like, "Oh, that is cool. Look at my cool thing." Right? It's
yeah,
the easiest way to break the ice, introduce yourself, and make everybody feel comfortable.
yeah. That wasn't that spicy.
A little spicy.
I was waiting for like a bulldog triple spicy ramen burn your face off, and that was just well seasoned.
Well seasoned. Yeah, I think for some people it's going to feel a little bit spicy. You know, like hearing I think the most spicy take is that just most women are not going to like Warhammer. I think that there's going to be people who really don't like that idea, really don't like hearing it. And I'm sorry, but it's just that's my
Okay, but are
reality.
any of those people going to be women that are really mad about hearing
No.
that?
No.
Then like,
No.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
don't care.
No. Yeah. It will be dudes. Yeah.
No, because I mean like, I do think Warhammer is due for maybe some more diversity, and I think that would be very good for all of us. But you also can't force that, and you can't like mandate it.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if a tournament was like, okay, we have to have a 50-50 like women to men ratio, and then like what they only open up another ticket every time like another woman signs up, and you're like, oh, this GT has 4 people at it.
Oh no, you know what would happen? Every dude would end up buying 2 tickets, one for their wife and one for them, and then the wife would just drop. That's what would happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just like yeah, it's just like it's such a weird way to like quantify progress. Like,
Mhm.
I would much rather see like, you know, more like younger people getting into the hobby, and like
Mm.
people in like different parts of their lives getting into the hobby, and like, you know, people have just like different ways of finding Warhammer and playing it and sharing it, and like, you know, like when I see some like little old granny who's just like, oh, I couldn't knit anymore, so I started painting miniatures, like I'm gonna be so stoked of just like,
Yeah.
that's awesome, like
Yeah.
that's so cool.
Or like that old guy who was like, "I kind of got sick of doing model planes, so I picked up this Warhammer kit." Like, yes, this is
Yes.
what I love. Yes. Um,
Yeah.
I thought maybe we could like share some tips for people because really I don't think the number of women in the hobby is the important thing. I think just making sure that your local space is more welcoming. So like maybe we should share some top tips for people who want to make their local space more inviting. Because I think you're going to have different ideas than me because you actively do get some animosity in your local area, whereas I don't.
That's fair. I mean, I mean, as far as like top tips, I still very much feel like I'm in the kind of trailblazing, like just being present a lot is a lot of the like work of just like, you know, when you go to a tournament and You know, you might be the first woman that person's ever played like Warhammer with, and just like having them experience that, and you know, whatever weird things they're gonna say, just being like, hey, that was kind of weird, like
Mhm.
maybe don't say that. And like just being in the space and kind of like taking up some of that space, and like feeling okay with taking up some of that space, and just like there's going to be people that don't want to talk to you, and there's going to be people that are uncomfortable, and I don't know, you just kind of have to like let them live in their discomfort, and like
I
too
call
bad, so
that
sad.
I call that letting the trash take itself out. If they decide that they
I
don't
love that. Oh, that's so good.
if they don't want to talk to you for something as stupid as your gender, good. You don't want to talk to them anyway. Let the
Right.
trash take itself out.
Yeah, so I do think like that's kind of the, like, you know, if you're in a local space and you're like, you know what, I love this thing and I enjoy it and I get a lot out of it, then like, you know what, sometimes you're gonna have bad games, and sometimes you're gonna have awkward games, and sometimes you're gonna like, you know, you want to think that like every person you meet at the table is a new friend, but like if they can't get out of their own way, then I love that. Just like let them take themselves out
Yeah.
and move on with your life.
Yep.
And there is a certain amount of like, it's unfortunate to say this, but if you are not like a like straight cis white dude in a Warhammer space, there's a higher likelihood you're going to have a harder time in some ways. And it might not be like an irredeemably hard time. Like it might not be like so hard you can't do it anymore, but just like it's unfortunate, but yeah, if you're kind of the first one who looks like you in that space, like you're gonna have to maybe deal with more than you should have to. And you know, I think just by being present and also not like succumbing to it and not letting it like fester. Like if somebody says
Mm,
something uncomfortable to you, be like, no, that's not cool. Like don't just don't be passively present, be actively present.
yeah. And I would also add to that, I think my biggest problem was 10 years ago when I was experiencing a lot of misogyny. I kind of let the awful things that people said to me kind of define how I saw myself, which
Mm,
I am unpacking now. So my advice is to not do that. When people say awful things like that to you, it is more indicative of them, and it doesn't have to mean anything to you, right? Um, and yeah, I mean, I say this as like do as I say, not as I do. Like I am a living sort of embodiment of social anxiety through really taking to heart the awful things that people told me about being a woman who plays this game. And yeah, you don't have to do that. I have been through therapy for it, actually. I think I still probably need a few more sessions, but um so I am working through it, but it's taking more energy than it should, and you could probably just forego that by knowing that these people are just awful, and it's not indicative of you at all in any way, shape, or form.
yeah.
And I also want to say, like, if you are a person who does look like everybody else, that there are some things that you can do to make it a lot
Yes.
nicer for people coming into your local group. And I can just sort of talk about the things that make me feel more comfortable in my local group. And one thing is not using a lot of really gendered language with people that you
Mm,
don't know. Right. So if somebody's playing somebody new, I don't think I've ever heard bro or gent or anything like that that's like really gendered. I think the most that I ever hear is dude. But I consider that gender neutral anyway. I I use dude probably more than I should for men and women equally. So that's probably like the most that I hear. And I think that that is a good way to be. I don't think that you should really use that kind of like weird super gendered language until you really have a strong understanding of the person across the table from you. That's going to take a few games, potentially up to a year to really know somebody. So that's like my one thing that I would say. And then the other thing that I would say is to like actively invite people to come to events. So
Mm.
if there's somebody new who's been playing a lot, and you know you have a super cool crew of people, like invite them to a game night, invite them to the upcoming tournament. um you know, if they're on the fence about the tournament, you could even be like, oh well, maybe just stop in one day and come look at the armies. That's still something I really like to do. If I can't make out like the full tournament, I'll still go and look at the tables and talk to people, and that's a really good way to make people feel included, even if they don't feel ready to like do a 2-day event, which understandable.
Yeah. I agree completely. Those are great tips. And yeah, the not super like I get sirred a lot at tournaments, which always just is like annoying.
It's not annoying though. It's more than annoying, right? Like
Yeah.
I actually find it heartbreaking. And to me it's weird because I don't even really hear that between dudes at tables next to me in my local area. I don't hear sir. I don't hear that
Mm.
gendered language. Like that feels a little bit sort of like old timer kind of.
Yeah, I mean I do hear it among other tables, so like I'm not gonna
Oh,
like
okay.
I don't know it. I have played against people that have used it pointedly to like try and tilt me. But you can usually tell that. I do think it's somewhat, you know, just like lack of exposure, or you know, like I mentioned earlier, like somebody was just like, I've never played Warhammer against a girl. Just like that, just like at the end of the game, just brutal honesty of just like, I'm sorry I did that, and I just like was on autopilot playing this game, and I'm like, okay, it still sucks, but like that's part of the just like being in the space and like helping change those narratives.
Hmm.
But I also know like I am also older and a little more jaded and a little, you know, crustier around the edges, and I can handle that.
Yeah.
My salt has hardened and condensed. But I do also know, you know, there's a lot of like much younger trans women that would like they wouldn't get through a
Not
game, and
They
they would just
wouldn't
be
handle
they've
it.
gone, they'd pack up, they'd be done, they'd just
Yeah.
be like, I'm never coming back. And like that's where the responsibility of not behaving like that is like, for every one of me that sticks it out, I would guarantee you there are multiple others that have been pushed out because they couldn't handle it,
Yeah.
and they shouldn't have
Um
had to handle it.
I agree. And one thing, so I did have like a pretty bad experience at one event in particular. It was just a small local RTT, and something that really meant a lot to me at that event was just having the tournament organizer come over and be like, "Hey, what happened? Like, hey, how can we make this right?" You know?
Mm,
That means a lot. So like if you see that your tournament organizer is not handling the situation, is not checking up on somebody, anybody, like literally anybody who's having a bad time, um maybe politely suggest that they do it, and then if they still don't do it, maybe just check up on them yourself. Like even if nothing else happens, but they feel seen and they feel like somebody is listening, it could go a really long way to keeping them in the community.
absolutely. And I think, you know, we talked about this last week. Like, retaining new people into the hobby is literally how this hobby doesn't die. Because there's a thousand reasons why even the most hardcore players, you know, run out of time, or they can't play, or they just get tired of an edition. So you
Mm.
will have attrition. And if there's no new people coming in, your local scene will die.
And I can say, by having been able to look at the demographics of some very large YouTube channels, we are in trouble.
This
Yeah.
is what I mean about like going back to that original point of like, you know, why are we not trying to be more welcoming to like, you know, teenage girls who are, you know, for whatever reason wanting to get into the grimdarkness of the far future. Like,
Yeah.
why are we not making sure that door is not as open as possible? Because sometimes it feels like we're doing everything to keep that door as closed as possible.
I just want to say something really cute on this sort of topic. One of the guys in my Warhammer team has a daughter, and she is the sweetest, cutest thing. She's always very excited when she sees that I'm playing with the guys, and she's too young to play. I cannot wait until she's old enough to play, but her dad got her a matching jersey, so she has this teeny tiny little matching jersey for the rest of us. And I do think that, like, even if there's a little girl or like a little gender exploring person in your local group who's not really ready to play in a GT, something like that goes a long way to making them want to stay. Like, they could be your dice caddy, at an event. You could invite them to, like, okay, I need 10 dice. Make sure you count out 10 dice. Like, you can include younger people in different ways that don't include, sitting across the table from them for 6 hours waiting for them to finish the game. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there's so many different ways. Like, you can introduce, like, hobbying, like, painting a lot earlier. If you have kids that are, like, expressing interest in it.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, you don't have to just be like, oh, you are not my son, therefore you are not allowed in the Warhammer club. Like, and you hear that, and it's, like, unnecessary of just, like, yeah.
It's funny because out of all of the kids in, like, the local, my team sort of sphere, like, Tasha's the only one who has any interest in it whatsoever. So, we're gonna try and, like, harbor that love. We're gonna try to keep going.
Because you also don't know, like, 5-10 years from now, she gets all of her friends into it, and then all of a sudden, like, your local Warhammer scene could be like all women.
50% women. Who knows?
Maybe it's more than 50%.
Maybe.
That's the other weird part of this, is, like, why do we gotta cap it either? Like,
yeah.
Like why you're just like, no, there's too many women now, get out. Like,
yeah.
I would love to hear of some local scene that is just like, yeah, it's, like, mostly women that play Warhammer around here. Like, there's not a lot of dudes. I'd be like, I'm getting on a plane. I just want to see it.
If you, like, exist in this meta, let us know. We will come visit.
I will 100%, wherever it is, I will figure out a way to get there, because I just would want to, like, experience that, because that would be amazing.
I feel like the doors would open and this, like, warm golden light would come out, and, like, there would be singing angels.
I feel like it's what meeting the Emperor would feel like.
Just golden light everywhere.
Yeah, like, not corpse emperor, like, working on the golden throne with his, like, his wrench or whatever, just like, hey, and you're like, oh, this feels good. This is what this
would
is.
Would it though? You're a chaos player. I guess you play guard right now, so I'll let you have it.
I mean, I play them pretty chaotically, so just meat for the grinder.
Oh well, I mean, yeah, okay. Fair.
Yeah. Any last thoughts before we? That's a pretty good last thought. But any other ones?
Just be a nice person. That's all.
Be nice, roll dice.
Be nice, roll dice, and if you see somebody in your local area who's not being nice, then I don't know, have a heart-to-heart with them. Don't
make the person that is receiving the bad treatment be the one to deal with that.
Yeah. Generally, it's better for your community if they don't have to do the emotional labor.
Yeah. Like, if you're relying on the person who's being, like, harassed or bullied or mistreated or just disrespected to stop the disrespect, like, you're putting way too much pressure on that one person. Like, just, like, if you have a TO that won't deal with it, like, even just get a group of you, like, a few of you together, and just go talk to them and just be like, hey, you're being crappy, and, like, either deal with it, or, like, maybe this is not the right thing for you to be doing. Like, if you can't handle being nice, then maybe you can't handle coming to these for a while.
Yeah. I like that.
That would be amazing. I would love to see that someday.
I'll come out there. I'll come out there and bully everybody.
I mean, bullying is also not okay in any direction. Like, just
Nah, I wouldn't. I would have a respectful conversation.
Okay.
If I heard anybody saying the kind of things that you said that they say to you in this podcast, I would be like, excuse me? Wait, what? What did you say? That's how it would start. Excuse me?
Well, we'll have to get you out here at some point.
Yeah.
On that note, I want to thank you all for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe to Chaos Divided wherever you're listening from, and you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Chaos Divided 40K. If you're a fan of what we're doing, you want to join our growing Wholesome Hammer community, find us at patreon.com/Chaos Divided 40K. Support the show, join the Discord. I just released another narrative mission, so I'm excited about that. So hopefully people will play it and have fun. And if you'd like to connect with us directly, we're at Tanya Gates on YouTube and at the.warmistress on Instagram. I'm at Blushing Noise Marine on Instagram and YouTube, and send some love to Nurgle Snurgle wherever she is. And until next time, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.